Thank you very much, Mairead. And I'm very happy to welcome Kathy Lee, who's a retired lecturer from the politics department at Cal Poly Humboldt. More recently, she's engaged in multiple ways with OLLI, including running a special interest group on public policy issues, and currently has a weekly discussion group on Zoom. She contributes in other ways to the community, including as a doula, and perhaps she'll uh, clarify some other things she does, like her work with the prisons. So, with no more said, I'm going to introduce Kathy. Thank you so much for being here, and thank all of you for being here.
Well, happy noon, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about a topic that has become much more part of the news these days. And can everyone see that now?
Yeah, you need to
Okay.
switch it over
Yeah,
to not having all the ones on the
I
side.
know. I'm
Yeah,
just making sure that it's sharing.
it's
Okay.
there.
Choke points and supply chains. So we've become really familiar with the choke point problem in looking at what's happened with the Iran war and the reduction of transit through the Strait of Hormuz. But that's just one part of this issue of the interconnected way that our lives exist today and the way that we access products. And that's a function of these supply chains. So we're going to look at both of those today with three specific examples. So supply chains, complex logistics systems that are converting raw materials into finished products and distributing them to consumers. But that's not the end of it, of course, because everything goes somewhere. So the end point of supply chains, of course, is the disposal of all of those raw materials and finished products by the consumers. So that's something that we have to consider. And another aspect of this, and I'm not really going to be addressing today, because this is kind of going to be mostly just this, these are the facts sort of thing. But our really interconnected world that we have today relies on massive amounts of energy and that energy being relatively cheap. And that's something that we've seen happen with the closure of the strait, that things have gotten more expensive. So modern society relies on these international systems. We extract the raw materials, we turn those raw materials into products, we then sell and distribute them, and then disposal or recycling on the end products. Globalization is not new. We think of it often as something that sort of emerged in the 1990s. But it's been around since humans have been moving around. This shows you the first sort of Eurasia in the first century. There was already extensive trade with India and with China at that point. In fact, the earliest trade starts from the Arabian Peninsula to the Indian subcontinent about 4000 BC, where they begin to use the monsoons to travel by sea between those two areas and bring products back and forth. So it's always been around, but it's gotten much more complex and much more widespread. Just to show you how it isn't terribly new, this was an essay that was written in 1958, and it was about a pencil. And so what they spelled out is even at that point, we have this idea that the United States was sort of self-sufficient and manufacturing all of our own products at that time. But here we are in the late 1950s. Wood is coming from the Pacific Northwest, the lacquer for the paint from Gujarat, India, the graphite for the lead from Sri Lanka, the clay that's necessary to put that together, Mississippi, wax from Mexico, metal, and the eraser, canola oil, pumice from Italy, rubber from Indonesia, and cadmium sulfide for the color. So just this really simple object, pulling all of these different products from all around the world. The movement of goods and services is really maximized for efficiency and low cost. This now it's maximized for efficiency and low cost in terms of finances, but there is a lot of hidden costs in that. And those externalities are the effects that this massive trade has on the environment, in all of the myriad ways that that happens. But that's not going to be our focus for today. It works really well until it doesn't, which you see in these very complex systems. They don't have a lot of redundancy. They don't have a lot of ability to sort of adjust to changes. So it makes them very vulnerable to widespread issues and sort of, a cascade of negative impacts when one link in that chain can break down. What they call optimization on efficiency. So you eliminate anything that might interfere with either the efficiency or higher profit margins. So you want to make the product as cheaply as you can, so that and as fast as you can, right? But that creates less resilience. And when things go bad, you don't have the ability to sort of adjust to that. So these are some of the global shipping choke points because a lot of our trade happens, via sea transport. And of course, we've seen the Strait of Hormuz, but there's actually in the Middle East, Bab al-Mandab, which is the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula, and also the Suez Canal. You might remember a couple of years ago, a large tanker got stuck sideways in the Suez Canal, and that caused a huge bottleneck of the transport at that point. And of course, there's the Panama Canal. And another one that's really important is called the Strait of Malacca, which you can see here is the way that you can avoid having to go around in order to get to Asia from India and the Middle East. So the Strait of Hormuz, I'm sure most of you are familiar with what has happened with shipping in the Strait. It used to be that there was on the average, over 100 um, tankers and all were going back and forth through that very, very narrow strait on any given day. And you can see what happened, and on February 28th, when the war began, when the US and Israel attacked Iran. And recently, you've seen an uptick, as a result of the ceasefire of shipping getting through, both going out of the Gulf and coming in, because the Gulf states rely heavily on imported food, and all sorts of things that have to come from the outside. And it increased a lot for a while with the ceasefire, but then there's been some attacks on shipping, so it's decreased again. And there's also some that's sort of sneaking through. Iran is doing something where they're going partway through the strait, offloading their oil onto another tanker, and then going back to Iran to fill up again. And so there's some unaccounted for oil that's getting through. There's also some that's getting through a pipeline that's going to the west. But it's not just oil. And this is the focus really has been on oil, but it's much, much more from that. Urea. Now, urea is ammonium is what is the main component in artificial fertilizers. About 46% of the global trade of urea comes from the Gulf, and it's manufactured there from natural gas. So that's had an impact on, particularly on third world countries that depended on this for food production. In many cases, the planting season was such that the crops had to be planted without the benefit of fertilizer, or at least without as much as they would have been using normally. Sulfur is used, it's about half of the sea-traded sulfur comes from the Gulf. It's used primarily to make sulfuric acid, which is used in a whole variety of different industrial processes. Methanol and glycol, again, components of petroleum. A third of the seed traded comes from the Gulf. This is really what they call feedstock, which are the precursors of things for resins, coatings, plastic, all of that is affected by this. Graphite feedstock. Graphite is used in batteries. Aluminum. A lot of aluminum comes from the Gulf. Uh, and that's aluminum takes massive amounts of energy to refine into a product that can be used. And so we see aluminum production in areas that have an abundant supply of energy. In North America, most of the aluminum that's used in the United States comes from Canada. And Canada has abundant energy from their hydropower, particularly in eastern Canada. So, in areas you don't see aluminum produced in places that don't have a lot of abundant energy. And because that was the case with natural gas in the Gulf, a lot of the aluminum plants there either had to be shut down or were actually damaged by attacks from Iran. So they are expected to be offline for quite some time. And then you might have heard about helium. Helium is also about a third of the global supply of helium comes from the Gulf, not just used for balloons, but necessary for semiconductor production and also for the MRI machines. So that's one example, which is probably you've seen a lot covered by the media. But I want to tell you the story of this particular bridge a little bit closer to home because it involves not only the interconnected nature of the supply chain for automobile manufacturing, but it also involves some of the corruption that's involved with the current administration. The Gordie Howe Bridge is a bridge that was built between Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit. And you can see here a modern bridge, six-lane bridge. And Gordie Howe, of course, was a Canadian hockey player who ended up playing for Detroit and thus got this bridge named after him. So the situation in this area was that there's a tremendous amount of trade that's going back and forth between Windsor and Detroit. And they had an old bridge, and we'll talk about that old bridge more in just a few minutes. And they decided that they needed to have this modernized bridge put in there. And this was negotiated between Stephen Harper, who was the Conservative Party Prime Minister of Canada, and then Snyder, who was the Republican governor of Michigan. So the state of Michigan got a 50% ownership stake in this $6.4 billion bridge that was built without putting up any money for it. The bridge was entirely paid for by Canada. American steel mills supplied the structural components. American labor unions built the decks. This was all part of the agreement. They said, if you're going to build this bridge, this is what you have to do. Once Canada recovered its initial investment through toll generation, because when you transport goods across the bridge, you have to pay a toll, all future revenues were to be split between Ontario and Michigan. And construction began in 2018. And at that time, President Trump was saying this was a great idea. He was all for it. Now, the Ambassador Bridge is the current bridge that connects these two cities. It was built in 1921, and it is owned and controlled by one family who charge very high tolls for any of the traffic coming across it. Plus, it only has two lanes on either side, so that does tend to have traffic jams on it. So the idea was we need a new modern bridge that will make it easier to transport, and the tolls that would be paid on the Gordie Howe Bridge were expected to be about half of the tolls that are charged on the Ambassador Bridge. So it's the Marone family. They own the bridge. They're a major Republican donor, including $1 million contribution to Trump-allied super PAC. A representative of the family and the company met with Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, earlier this year, shortly before Trump made a decision to demand a federal cut of toll profits and changes to Canadian policy before he would allow this bridge to be opened. Ontario refused that because it was something that was not in the original agreement. And so as a result, the bridge has not opened. Now, this was a Truth Social post from Trump. He said he wasn't going to let the bridge open until the United States was compensated for everything that we've given to Canada, and that they need to treat us with more respect. And when we have been given, with all that we have been given them, we should own perhaps at least 1/2 of this asset, and the revenues generated because the U.S. market will be astronomical. Thank you for your attention to this map. So I want to share with you a quote from an article by one of the suppliers for what is really not an American auto industry, but a North American auto industry, because it is incredibly connected. And he's talking about one part here that's used in automobiles. The forging comes from Mexico, which means they take the raw ore and they refine it into a usable ore, which then goes to the US to get some further processing, comes to Canada for further processing, back to the US for further processing, over to Canada where we do the final assembly, and then it gets distributed back to the US as well as Mexico and Canadian auto plants. So this is a fully integrated system where they have, and this is the result of the North American Free Trade Agreement that was negotiated in the early 1990s. Now, this is a great graph, and I know it's small, so you can't see, but what they're talking about there is not a transmission, but a transmission module that goes through 7 steps. It starts in Ontario as scrap metal, and then it gets changed into smelted steel, and aluminum housings are put in it from in Mexico. Other parts assembled in Illinois and sent to Canada. Parts sent to transmission assembly plant. Completed transmissions are sent for vehicle assembly. Vehicles delivered to the dealerships. So this is, I mean, this is what I mean when I said that we have a North American auto industry. We don't have an American one. Could we do it all on our own? Yes, we could, but it would take longer and it would be more expensive. And under this system of maximizing efficiency and low cost, that's why we've ended up with this complex system. Now, the next one I want to talk about comes from this really, really interesting book that's called Material World. Ed Conway is a British journalist, and he's written a book that talks about these 6 substances and all the products that come from them, and he traces it from the raw materials until the finished product for all of these. I really recommend this book. It might sound dry and uninteresting, but it's really a great book. And in particular, we're going to focus on sand. Now, sand is the basic product that ends up being silicon, which is then used in computer chips. So the first transistors, which were essentially an electrical switch developed in the late 1940s, integrated circuits, small electronic pathways, transistors. Remember, a lot of us are old enough to remember when transistor radios first became available. They were quite the thing in the late 50s and early 60s. The first modern computer chip was created in 1971. And those chips have gotten smaller and smaller and able to store more and more and more transistors. Today, 15 million transistors can fit into a space the size of the period at the end of this sentence. As Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer, said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And when you think about all of the information that we put on those computer chips, it does often seem to be indistinguishable from magic. So computers went from vacuum tubes to these early transistors to what we see today of these very, very complex systems, which we have just sort of come to take for granted. For example, the first smartphones were available just about 20 years ago. And now they have become ubiquitous and people have become very, very dependent on them. So the first step in getting the silicon chip that's going to run this phone starts in Spain. And that is getting the quartz that's going to be used to make silicon. And it's at Santiago de Compostela, I would think is the end point of the long hike that people take there. There is a special mine that has the high quality quartz that's necessary to begin this process. So that's where they mine the quartz initially. And then I'm sorry, these graphics ended up changing when it moved over to a presentation, but I think you can see the text. Quartz, silicon dioxide, is then heated with coal at really high temperatures in the presence of an electrical current to remove the oxygen that's in it so that you end up having silicon metal. So you're removing the dioxide from each of these molecules. And then it gets sent to Germany, where there's a special factory called Wacker Polysilicon. And they use a further process called the Siemens process to break down and reform that silicon metal into tubes. It's extremely energy intensive, 3,000 times more energy than making cement and 1,000 more than turning iron into steel. At the end point, you end up with what they call semiconductor grade silicon, polysilicon, which is 99.9999999% pure. Okay. It then gets sent to Vancouver, Washington, to a Chinese company, Shin Etsu, where they turn that polysilicon into silicon wafers. And the process there is called now this is going to be a Czech one, Szokralski process. So they pour that into a pure quartz crucible and melt it at high temperature. And then they have a single crystal of silicon to pull out to form this single perfect crystal. And then they make that into a metallic cylinder, which then they slice into very, very thin slices. This is a process that takes months to complete. And it's also, the Pacific Northwest also has a lot of hydropower, so they have a lot of electricity. And this is one of the reasons that this plant is located on the Columbia River. So, but they need those quartz crucibles, right? And those quartz crucibles have to be of special grade, so that and you have, no contamination with anything else. They have to be very, very clean in order to do that. And those quartz crucibles, you can't get just anywhere. They come from Spruce Pine, North Carolina. And this is a Belgian company working with an American company, Quartz Corporation. And the purity of the quartz that's necessary to make the crucibles that are necessary to make the silicon wafers are really limited to that location. It's a very secretive situation, tight security. They're always afraid that some other country is going to indulge in industrial espionage and learn how they do this and then take it away from them. Now, to show you a choke point here, the single road to the mines where they can get the quartz that they can make into these crucibles was closed due to the damage from Hurricane Helene. So it was offline for several months until they were able to get that cleaned up and get this process going again. So we now have the silicon wafers and we have the crucible that's been necessary to make those silicon wafers. And off it goes now to Taiwan. And the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which most people know as TSMC. 90% of the silicon that's produced in the world is used for solar panels. China is the largest producer of that, but they don't have the ability to make these high quality chips. And the chips that are needed for cell phones and other really complicated electronics require these very, very high quality silicon chips. China also is used a lot of coal for energy of production of it. And, it has problems with their treatment of their workers, particularly in Xinjiang province with the Uyghur population. And they have not been able to produce quality silicon wafers. So TSMC is the world leader in this. Also, the head of TSMC has said if China decides that they're going to invade Taiwan, they are going to shut down this factory so it's not usable. So they're using that kind of as a way to sort of preclude China from moving forward to take over Taiwan. This factory was heavily subsidized by the Taiwanese government. The circuits are input by lasers. It creates tiny channels and grooves in these silicon wafers. And it's mostly automated because it's so complex and it has to be so clean. As I said, a single stray atom can damage a chip. And producing these chips takes several months. So this whole process from extracting that quartz in Spain and getting to a chip that's usable in a cell phone is something that's going to take a couple of years. So an interference in that process can have a really long-term effect. In the same way that we're seeing is that some of the things as the result of the shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz are going to be playing out over several years in the impact on those other processes that it used the materials that were coming from there. Some pictures of the inside of this factory. And they use this very, very complex system of mirrors and laser lights in order to imprint these chips with the information that they need. And of course, they need, each one of these machines, if you trace it back, has components that are coming from all over the world. In this case, these mirrors are coming from Switzerland, and so you can't produce these things unless you've got these components that are coming from all over the world. And then finally, it goes to a factory in China where it's turned into an iPhone. As they point out, China spends more on imported chips than it does on imported oil. And the final
How
product,
did you learn all this,
it's in
Kathy?
that book,
Oh,
Material World. That's why I say it's such a fact. He does this with every one of those substances where he traces the whole process that they're used.
oh my
The
gosh.
final product has that chip, glass, plastic, metal. Again, the glass, plastic, and metal are all components that are coming from all over. And lastly, the end of the chain is e-waste. About 5 billion phones are thrown away each year. Now, here's a question for discussion that we can have at the end. If people had to choose between their phones and representative democracy, what do you think would happen? If the question was limiting digital devices or addressing climate change, what do you think would happen? But the real question is, should we shorten this supply chain? The current administration's policy is yes, we need to cut down on imported components and start a manufacturing boom in the United States where we would manufacture all of these things in the US and not have to rely on things coming from outside. Um, Policy changes can make nations more resilient and less dependent on external sources of goods, but there's no such thing as a free lunch. There'll be higher labor costs. And as a result of higher labor costs, you pay higher prices. Some products may not be available. You just simply will not have access to them, and the quality of the goods will suffer. So this is a big issue with big challenges, and it's one that operates pretty much under the surface of everything that's happening in our lives. That, practically every product that we have ends up including all of these different components. And I wondered, Julie, would you be willing to share your own exploration of your remodel and the different countries that were involved? You're still muted though. Let's see if I can unmute you.
Um, no, it was actually pretty fascinating. I mean, I'm just sort of like overwhelmed right now. I'm glad I had my sound off because you would have heard me either shouting, crying, or laughing. But when I was doing my bathroom, I got curious about what the impacts were. I was suspicious that the person who was doing the project was probably a pretty staunch Republican and had supported Donald Trump. It didn't come up, but there's just a lot of indicators of that. So I was just curious about seeing how the tariffs would be affecting my cost and his costs. So I took all of the products that he was using in my little tiny bathroom, of which there were about at least nine that I could identify. Um, and even the things that I thought were American made were not. There was nothing that was really American made in my bathroom, even though that's something I would generally support. I think it's good to buy local. Um, it wasn't even a question. And then, of course, when I got to the copper and the wiring and the inner workings of the faucets and so forth, it was sort of like what you're talking about, except I really only understand about a tenth of what you explained. But it was very complicated and it involved all kinds of transport and all kinds of tariffs, and it was nuts. It was just, I mean, it was not something I was taking into account when I was redoing
Mhm.
the bathroom. I could have not done it, but I was afraid I was going to fall in my bathtub, basically. All stressed.
Priorities, priorities.
Yeah, that was
I wonder if anyone has questions before we just kind of open it up for discussion.
How is it that we can calculate what kind of tariff to put on something, whether to go to war to defend Taiwan based on the fact that we're so dependent on their chips and we don't have, I mean, they're working to build up Intel, but all these must be major factors in, for example, whether we defend Taiwan.
One would think, if we were kind of making decisions based on a broader understanding of it, but because so much of this just goes under the radar, I think that most people have no idea how how much our world is integrated in that way. including the people making those decisions in the current administration.
So that when we slapped tariffs on everything we did, um, we we disrupted that system phenomenally much. And the
Well, I
bridge,
don't, yeah, I think you probably noticed if you've been ordering anything online recently that, and trying to avoid Amazon, that the cost of shipping has gone up a lot. And that, that's a function not only of the higher cost of fuel, but a lot of the fact that a lot of these products have components that are coming in from other places. Of course, the auto industry in North America has not been subject to tariffs. And I think that the reason for that is really the clout of the auto industry because they know how dependent they are on the components that are going back and forth between Mexico, Canada, and the US. Other
well,
questions, folks?
he retained the specifications under the agreement,
Yeah, although he allowed he said he negotiated a better agreement in his first term, but he's allowed that agreement to lapse, so it's kind of in limbo right now.
except it's still functioning the way it was.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Other
Beth,
folks,
I
any
just
questions?
I just want to add one more sentence to my report because what I did with all the information that I got was I put it on a piece of paper and buried it in the wall in my bathroom so somebody would find it 100 years from now. My best recollection is it involved like several continents. It was, I mean, there were parts from the Netherlands of all places, and of course Japan, Mexico, China, and nations of Africa because of the metals. But anyway, it was fascinating just for that one tiny microcosm of my life. But it's in the wall. I can't get it out.
But someone will find it
Someone will find
someday.
it. Hmm.
The implications of the bridge were that because the owner of the other bridge was collecting tariffs and was a big Republican donor, that he kiboxed the whole thing on the new bridge.
Well, yeah, and that was part of it, but Trump has been trying to put a lot of pressure on Canada because he thinks it should be the 51st state. And and so this was also part of that was that the pushback again. There's an effort to sort of support. There are separatists in Alberta, which is kind of the Texas of Canada, and they want to have a referendum to leave Canada. And the United States has been um, surreptitiously funding that and sending, various and sundry government and non-governmental people to Alberta to sort of support that.
Is there any
Not
time
surprised.
frame
Go ahead.
is there any time frame for having the chips produced wholly in the US?
Um, it's conceivable that they could do it. It would probably take at least a decade to get that set up, I think, because you think about all the different components that would have to happen for that. Um, it would make them much more expensive, anything that use those chips.
Okay,
It's,
thank you.
it's conceivable that you could.
Are they trying to make that happen?
Well, they're trying to increase chip production in the US, but TSMC pretty much has a monopoly on these very, very high-end chips.
And that's what's used in NVIDIA production.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I figured. So we really, that is a huge leverage that China has in terms of our relationship with them and uh, how we handle the Taiwan issue, right?
Yeah. And there are analysts who kind of, have sort of focused their efforts to understand this issue, that say that China is unlikely to do a hard annexation of Taiwan, probably more a gradual control of it over time using financial incentives and things like that, especially seeing as the United States is more or less sending the message that, we're concerned with the Don Roe doctrine, in the Americas, and not so much about Asia and Europe. Karen, did you have a question?
Yes. I, well, more of a comment. It sounded to me like there are specific places in the world where different components are only available at that place. We cannot produce things that we have no access to. And so it is, I think it's a false narrative to think that we can do exactly what some of these other places are doing. And the other thing is, in order to get to along with your family, your friends, your neighbors, the community of the world, we need to have interactions. For example, if China wants to keep making our phones, we need to keep being nice to them because we have a part to do in that those 7 steps and 7 continents or whatever. Um, it's not practical. It's not practical position for the United States to feel totally independent of everyone.
Well, we could do it, but remember, things are going to be more expensive. Some products may not be available, or the products may be lower quality, right?
Therefore,
Um,
it's not practical.
well, it's not practical. And your point about being nice to other countries, I think it's less important that we be nice to them, but that we be reliable and
Yes,
predictable.
yes,
And the one thing that really interferes with the functioning of markets is that, what's going to happen tomorrow aspect of it. And that chaos is one of the things that's kind of increased our vulnerability, because the United States is now has an as perception as not being a reliable trade partner.
Karen is saying something close to what I was thinking, and then I was thinking of the dark side of what you were saying, Karen, is that it seems like it's a good defense posture. It's like if we're interconnected, we can't be theoretically terrorizing or bombing these other parts of the world and vice versa. It seems like we're in partnerships. It's that old sort of biological diversity thing. All the
Mhm.
parts are needed to survive. And I don't know that any of the guys are thinking of that when they're bombing other countries, but it seems to me that that's pretty obvious. I mean, it's about being nice, but it's also about we could just assume we need each other.
Sure.
yes.
And if you're saying that we really need to, make the transition, the energy transition away from fossil fuels to renewables, we need a lot of materials that are not necessarily available here in order to make that transition.
Do you think that that is understood by the current administration, what the
No,
interdependency is? I don't think it is.
no, it's not. And well, it's confusing because there are people, for example, the Secretary of Energy and Burgum, the Secretary of the Interior, who know these things. I mean, Wright, for example, the energy secretary, has 2 degrees from MIT, and yesterday he was celebrating the fact that the administration has canceled all the wind and solar projects that were in the pipeline. Um, and in order to be part of the power structure, they've sort of checked their knowledge base at the door and are kind of just following what's supposed to be the line that they follow.
Why can't he? They're all afraid to tell them the reality. Is that what it boils down to?
I don't think they're afraid, because if they were afraid, they could leave. I think they want to be part of the power structure. I mean, that's the only thing that makes
Well,
sense.
that's what I mean. They're afraid of not being part of the power structure, so they don't want to say anything.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because
So
the
they're
people,
unwilling to speak truth to power.
right. Yeah. What about that question about democracy or smartphones from some of you folks that haven't weighed in yet? You don't even have to go live. You can just use your sound. Anyone?
Restate the question, Kathy. The full
If
question.
you had to choose between democracy or your cell phone, what do you think people would do?
I think they would choose their cell phone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I would not. Democracy is precious, I think.
Well, they
So,
wouldn't miss it immediately. That's the
no,
problem.
yeah.
Well, I think, John, too, I suspect, and maybe my read or Jonah could weigh in on this, because we're old, and we haven't had this all of our lives. It's not the same for us.
Well, one of the things that that question makes me think of is how important cell phones have been for the spread of democracy.
Joanne, we can't hear you really well. Can you maybe speak up a bit?
Oh, uh, I don't have my microphone.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, much
Okay.
better.
It seems to me that one of the things that has really spread democracy in our time are the iPhones, the ability of people to instantly connect with each other. So to choose one or the other, I don't know. I don't have an iPhone. I would choose democracy, but I see the connection between that ability to gather a group together, to
Mhm.
let people know what's coming up in a week.
It's a
Sure.
false choice.
Well, yes, it is. But again, it's sort of the phone is sort of a metaphor for our modern way of life, being able to, at the touch of a keyboard, to be able to get access to any product that we want, right? Um, and we've become very dependent on that way of life. We've become very dependent on our high energy intensity that we have.
And we're going to need more.
And so, it's really a question, and I think you see it in the climate debate, uh, because we know what's causing climate change. We know what we need to do to address it, uh, but it's not being done.
Could we start with why 1 billion phones are thrown away each year and maybe just everybody gets one at birth and that's it?
Well, I mean, it's really true, because it's the sort of the epitome of planned obsolescence, that there are new features that come, and so the desire to have the latest version of it is pretty strong.
That's different than the issue of planned obsolescence in the sense of quality. It's more an issue of the new features and the advancements at the incredible rate we're getting them. You can't keep up. It's like, what's the latest? And I mean, there's a new one almost every year.
Yes, that's right. And that's why we throw away 5 billion phones every year.
We haven't figured out how to recycle them very well, have we?
Well, I mean, it is possible. It is possible to do. And for a long time, that sort of it's dirty work. If you're doing it on the cheap, there are ways of doing it in a way that's productive, but it tends to be more expensive. So,
We send a lot of that abroad, don't we? Our
well,
electric.
we used to send a lot to China, and China's said we don't want it anymore. So a lot of it goes to India or Bangladesh.
And they pick them apart and retrieve the metals and minerals and
Hmm.
things like that that they
Yeah.
want, that they can make money with. And then the rest, it's like the clothes. I was listening to something on the clothing industry and what happens to all this overproduction of clothes.
Hmm.
And we ship it out. What we can't do here, we ship it out. It ends up being burned in the desert and causing tremendous waste.
Hmm.
Because they can't all do everything. I mean, we just produce so much. We overproduce all over the place.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the bottom line about this is that, and the reason I thought it was important to share it is so that we're aware of this level of interconnection, and the fact that our lifestyle really depends on all of these inputs from nameless and faceless people all over the world. And that it's not really possible to have a modern lifestyle and um, and isolate that within our own country.
Has anybody thought about establishing a world democracy of some sort?
Well, I think that was the idea post World War II behind all of the different intergovernmental organizations that were set up.
Right.
Um, but there's power tends to concentrate even within those organizations.
Yeah.
We are seeing what is likely to be a decades-long reorganization of the international world, just because of the change, the incredibly rapid change in the status of the United States in international organizations, in international trade, uh, and it's going to be interesting times ahead.
Do you see one particular organization or a series of organizations that are really tackling the size and scope of this project?
Of which trade,
Yeah,
international trade?
yeah. I mean, are they
Well,
being effective?
well, that was the attempt of the World Trade Organization.
Yeah.
Um,
And then we backed out.
well, I mean, it's still there.
No. But it
Um,
doesn't function without us.
well, it's kind of like, you know, the powerful do what they will, and the weak have to suffer what they must. Uh, but just again, just the knowledge of what goes into this process is, I think, is a one part of solving the puzzle. because you can't address the problems that we see, which is inequality and environmental degradation and climate change and all, without understanding how the system works, um, and and what is causing those problems.
Do you think AI will help us better understand and portray the reality of what's involved and come up with some solutions, the best way to go forward?
I don't know, you're talking to a real AI skeptic. You know, we have projected, we have anthropomorphized AI as as an actual thinking
Entity.
things, as opposed to language extruding machines that regurgitate the information that's been fed into them.
It's a great name for it, language extruding
It's
machines.
not, it's
Like
not
it
original.
squeezes it out.
It's not original. It's from a book called it's the AI hype or the AI scam or something like that.
Well,
Um,
the AI is taught by humans, so whoever is in power is the one who programs it, right?
well, it's not, what they do is they feed all of this information into it, and then, you query, right? And then it pulls from that information to give you an answer.
Mhm.
Um, but it's not sentient.
Not yet.
Not yet, and
It can't.
probably not ever.
It
Uh,
can't.
so, there's a tremendous amount of hype that's gone along with this. And I saw something the other day that they were hiring a whole bunch of young people who had graduated sort of, immersed in AI, um, and then found that they were really doing better if they hired liberal arts students who had a better ability to problem solve and come up with solutions to problems. So I think that's going to play out. I mean, there's some things that AI is really, really good at, and other things that it's not appropriate. I think it was Ford fired a whole bunch of their engineers and replaced it with AI, and then ran into such quality control problems that they had to rehire the engineers. So, it's going to be there, but it's not quite as transformative as it's been hyped to be. At least that's the perspective of an AI skeptic.
Yeah.
I am also a skeptic, but I'm wondering if the only way to effectively approach that problem and the problem of whether or not we should go alone and do everything ourselves is we need to educate the public. People need to have more information. Um,
But they have to want to get the information.
we have to want to educate our children and ourselves. It's a cultural problem. We are getting dumber, not smarter.
Well, I just have to say, my partner thinks that AI raised the average IQ considerably. AI is a lot smarter than the average American. And I have to say, there may be some truth to that.
But
Kathy, sorry.
they've got the facts or the history, but they don't think.
Right, right. But still,
And
it's better than
and you
nothing.
can't think unless you have some basic facts to work with and make connections and consider the alternatives.
Gee, Karen.
Yeah, well, and we're over time here, so we should sum this up. But I think that I used to think that, you know, again, my initial graduate research was in climate change policy. If people just understand this, if we can just explain it to them, then they'll get it and they'll understand what we need to do. And that's not the way it works. We have all the facts in the world right now, but it's, we've got a lot of smart people, but not a lot of wise people.
Yeah.
And
Good way to put it.
there's a difference between them.
And
So
we have
on
to
that
find ways
happy
to
note,
go ahead. Well, we have to find ways to explain it in terms that they can understand.
well,
And that's tough.
what is that Orwell quote? If it's hard to convince a man of something if his paycheck depends on him believing the opposite.
That's a good
It
one,
might
yes.
not be Orwell, it might be somebody else, but yeah. Yeah, that's one of the problems.
Well, the
Okay,
basic,
well,
the basic
thanks for
components.
learning about supply chains.
Thanks for teaching us
Yes,
about
it was
supply
great,
chain.
Kathy. Thank you.
Okay, everyone have a good day.
Okay,
Thank you
thank you
very
Really
very
much.
much.
appreciate it. Thank
Go
you
and
ever
Yeah.
so
This
much.
was this was great. Thank you.
enjoy the sunshine.
Yeah, it's finally arriving
Yes.
slowly.
All right, take care.
You
Okay,
too.
bye-bye.